Well, enough of such frivolity. We have wrestling talk to do and a little classic wrestling talk at the start of this thing because, we've done some St. Louis history in the past. The folks seem to like that when we delve because St. Louis was the capital of wrestling for so many years in the 40s and 50s. And the people have liked that. And as a matter of fact, Jared from St. Louis wrote, "Hello, Jim and Brian. I recently emailed you about the passing of my grandfather. My family was going through some things in his house, and we found an old letter from a friend of my grandfather describing seeing my grandparents on TV at a wrestling show. The letter says the date of the show was May 19th, 1951. What can you tell me about this era of St. Louis wrestling and who might have been on the card that night?" I thought, well, this will be easy, right? I'll just go to the St. Louis program archive. I'll go to May 19th, 1951, and I will jot these things down and give Jared a little thrill, right? That's what I figured I'd do, Brian. It wasn't that easy because now we've got a mystery on our hands because there was no wrestling card in St. Louis on May 19th, 1951. As we've talked about when we've done the St. Louis history, Sam Muchnick, who was running the one wrestling promotion, and Martin Thez, who was running the other wrestling promotion, they were actually secretly working together, but they were still, and I've got my notes falling all over the place over here. They were working together, but they were still separate entities, and they ran basically weekly on an alternate basis. Muchnick ran every 2 weeks. Thez ran every 2 weeks. And they would do seasons. So the wrestling season in St. Louis would open anywhere from the middle of September to the first part of October, and they would run through to the following spring. In April 1951, the wrestling season ended on Friday, April 27th. And at that time, Muchnick was advertising an opening date in the fall for the 51-52 campaign of either September 14 or 21st, and it ended up being October 5th. So while there was no wrestling card live in St. Louis on May 19th, it still could have been on television. Remember, we found the little trivia bit, Brian, that the first world title change was televised in St. Louis in 1947, an experimental broadcast from the Kiel Auditorium. And what was it? Was it Watson and Longson? Goddamn, now we found trivia, and then I forgot the trivia we found.
Yeah, I forgot what the match was. I think it was definitely Longson, but I'm not sure.
It was Longson, and that was either one or the other, Watson or Thez. But the point is, there was experimental television in St. Louis. We know for a fact from these programs and documents in 1947-48, but then we've talked about there was no local television. There was television wrestling on in the early 50s because of the networks. But there was no local wrestling televised in St. Louis because Muchnick wanted a sponsor to pay for the broadcasts. And then in 1953, he got the beer company. And that ran for a few years. So now I'm like, okay, if there was no wrestling at the Chase going on at this time. There was no local wrestling television program, but they still could have been on the news from a clip from the arena or the Kiel or whatever, except there was no card that night or anywhere in that month. So now I'm really fucking perplexed as to but was it a situation where they lived in St. Louis, but maybe they were at another location and they were actually seen on the Chicago wrestling program? Jared, the point is, we can't figure this out by these dates and this information, but I can tell you a little something about the era of St. Louis wrestling because I thought this might be just a little fun to look at the 2 months, March and April of St. Louis, just for some of the big matches, because in this season closing program, let's do this math. Brian, since the previous October, since the wrestling season began. So October, November, December, January, February, March, and April, not counting April 27th, that card. More than 125,000 fans had bought tickets to Sam Muchnick's wrestling cards. And if you counted in the Thez promotion, the Mississippi Valley Sports Club, and a benefit program that was done for charity in March that drew 12,000 people, in those 7 months, 250,000 people bought tickets to see pro wrestling in the city of St. Louis. Just a little over half a year. The highlight of those shows was 17,796 people that came to the arena, later the Checker Dome, and then whatever they call it these days, to see the Lou Thez Buddy Rogers world title match. That was 18,000 people there when they're running the town weekly. And then Rogers and Thez had a rematch on April 13th and drew another 12,000 people. And the combined gate for those two shows, the two Thez and Rogers matches, was $40,000. $40,000 in 1951 is equivalent to $440,000 today. So in a town that they were running every week and had been for 7 months, just those two shows alone drew 30,000 people and the equivalent of over $400,000 in today's money. And they've also got the taxes. The taxes collected just on the Sam Muchnick events. And bear in mind, again, $1 equals $11 today. So times 11. Just on the Muchnick shows, he paid $17,000 federal tax, $5,000 state tax. So that's the equivalent of over $170,000 and over $50,000, $4,500 to the city, $1,600 in sales tax, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, which sponsored the programs because they had to have a charitable sponsor for athletic contests, they got $1,650 just for being the group that they affiliated with. That's some fucking business. And the cards that they were booking at the time, you know, yes, they'd use the local guys in the underneath matches, but you had some of the biggest names in the business flying into St. Louis on a regular basis, whether it be Thez or Rogers or Longson, or in this case, hold on here, a good program. I'm just trying to flip across. The season closer also featured Abe King Kong Cashy, who, remember, he's the veteran that had Vern Gagne's first match. So St. Louis wrestling was doing great, Jared, in 1951, but we can't find your grandparents. But can you imagine any city in this country now, Brian, where pro wrestling would have that kind of... And again, this is 70 years ago. What was the population of St. Louis 70 years ago? And can you imagine any modern day promotion having that kind of profile in a major metropolitan area in a big city in the United States, to where they were literally drawing, so what's 250,000 divided by 7? Let's divide it by 5 just to make it easier. But they were drawing 40,000 people a month to the live events on average.
I have here the population.
It's not even doable today. What was the population then?
So we're talking 1950?
1951, but same thing.
Yeah, it has it every 10 years, obviously. So 1950, for St. Louis City, 856,796. And for St. Louis County, 406,349.
So a metropolitan area of 1.2 million people.
Mm-hmm.
Selling 40,000 or more wrestling tickets every single month to the major arena in town, both of the major arenas in town. Think that's going to happen anytime soon again? and they could afford to take the summer off. It was just too hot in the Kiel Auditorium in those days. So how are we going to track down Jared's grandparents any closer than that?
Well, there's different websites. You take their DNA and you send it in, and they try to figure out where your family is and who they are and what they are, where they're from.
Where they're from, what they are, what they're all about, what their white blood cell count is. If you don't get that white blood cell count up, you ain't going to have kids.